We're going to begin now, and I want to welcome you to the subplenary titled Environmental Geopolitics in Asia, Lessons for Fit for Purpose Policy Analysis. My name is Ben Cashore, and I'll be the chair of this subplenary. As many of you may know, I've recently moved from Yale's Environment School to join the Kuan School of Public Policy. And as part of that effort, we're engaging in significant ways with the environmental challenges governing Asia from a Singaporean, ASEAN-wide, and transnational context. So we feel very privileged and honored to have the opportunity to bring together three leading faculty from the Kuan School of Public Policy who work on these issues. And our goal here is to have a conversation with you and the ESG community about how we think about the relevance of our broad scholarly research on environmental politics in the context of Asia, and what it all means for generating lessons for the policy process and policy design for all of us who care about taking our knowledge on the environment and sustainability and making a difference in this world. And that is, after all, the purpose ultimately of the ESG network. So with that, I'm going to give a little bit of the PowerPoint to introduce the panel, and then I'm going to act as a chair and ask our three panelists some questions. So I'm now going to share my screen with you, and I think I'm going to succeed in doing that. Yeah, can you all see that just fine? Yeah. So there's our title for our subplenary. And ultimately, what we're curious about is having a conversation with three leading sustainability experts about how can and does Earth systems governance scholarship inform policy design. And so behind this question is the recognition that most of our research actually has some kind of purpose. We don't just study the environment because it's a topic by itself, but because it has an important aspect to governing our lives and our impact on the Earth. But this requires translating what our research means for applied analysis and insights. But how do we do this, and how do different disciplines and subdisciplines think about translating this knowledge to making recommendations for policy undertakings? So those broad questions are what this panel is designed to address, especially in the context of Asia. And I just want to point out that it's actually part of the Kuan School of Public Policy's broader environment and sustainability initiatives, highlighted by two we think are really interesting developments. The first is our efforts now to build the Public Policy Institute for Environment and Sustainability within our school. The current acronym is PPIES. And secondly, we're excited about our proposal to join the ESG network as a leading Asian research hub. So this panel is in part designed to be part of that process, to engage and become part of the ESG network. So to do that, we brought together an incredibly exciting panel of three leading faculty on these questions, each of whom come with these questions in important but distinct ways. And this is why we want to generate a conversation among different kinds of scholars, all who are working on these critical challenges on sustainability and the environment. So I'm going to just briefly introduce each of our panelists all at once, so we can then not break up the flow in the question and answer part of this effort. So we have Dr. Marina Kaneti, who works, will be talking about her research on resource extraction and the Belt and Road Initiative. Broadly, she studies China's environmental and climate leadership initiatives in the context of, whoops, excuse me for my problems with Zoom. There we go, in the context of Belt and Road and beyond, and examines the larger impact of these questions on a global environmental governance, as well as their potential alignment with concrete, tangible solutions to the climate crisis. And then we have Dr. Sreeja Nair, who's just joined us, and although did her PhD also years ago in the LKY school, will be reflecting on her work on bottom-up climate change adaptation initiatives in India, as well as agricultural and food systems. And she is a self-described interdisciplinary scholar, specializing in the environment and policy. She studies policy processes and tools of governments, focusing on the interplay of science and politics. And her research is largely based in Asia and covers issues facing high uncertainty in the future policy context, such as climate change, food and water security. And by the way, has a fantastic book coming out from Cambridge University Press on policy piloting, which you must all go purchase after this talk. And then we have our third speaker is Dr. Vinod Thomas, who will be talking about his experience in sustainable finance in the context of India and China. His biography and impact are too large to talk about in one quick bullet point, but I want to highlight just that he is the former Director General of Independent Evaluation of the Asian Development Bank, and his work there was instrumental in making green growth and action on climate change more integral to ADB's strategy and policy choices. And he has published widely on macroeconomic, social, and environmental issues, and among them, of course, climate change and natural disasters. So those are a brief introduction to our three wonderful LKY school colleagues. The plan for this session is that I'm going to ask 2 rounds of questions. After that, I will turn to the to comments and audience for questions after those 2. But in between the 2 rounds, if you have any comments or questions as they're giving their answers, please put it in the chat function, and then I'll take those chats and coalesce them when I ask a moderator questions as well. But we'll give lots of time for engagement after the panelists answer the 4 questions in 2 parts. And then we're also going to have a little bit of time afterwards for those who want to stick around after the panel to ask more informal questions as well. So that is the plan today. And I'm going to first go to the questions that are right here before stopping sharing screen. And I'm going to begin with the first 2 questions. And we're going to go in the order that I talked about the panelists. So first, Professor Kaneti, then Professor Nair, then Professor Thomas. So with that, I will start. And the first 2 questions are, first, what geo-environmental problems does your research focus on? And how would you characterize your overall findings in the context of this panel? And I'll come back to the second ones after we have this first round of responses. I'm going to stop sharing now and turn it over to Professor Marina Kaneti, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Ben, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. It is really great to be part of this panel, and I'm just really sorry I cannot be physically in Bratislava today, so greetings from Singapore. Over the past few years, I have been tracking China's engagement with climate change policies and dialogue, both at the level of global governance, such as the COP dialogue, as well as the evolving environmental policies associated with the Belt Road Initiative. In terms of my overall findings, and given the limited time that we all have here, 3 main areas China's global engagement in environmental issues is rapidly evolving process, as is, of course, China's engagement with the world more broadly. The pressure from the EU and the United States has certainly had some direct and indirect effect on how China's leaders engage in global climate dialogue and how the country takes on key climate-related leadership positions. Second, there continues to be a key misperception across policymakers and academics in the global north, particularly in their impression that China operates as a homogeneous entity where companies, banks, and workers overseas are fully governed and follow the central government directives. The picture is far more complex than that, and even at the time when there are relevant guidelines and policy initiatives, their implementation and enforcement remains a significant challenge. Turning on the pressure on China without taking account of basic development dynamics in other countries also makes for a poor attempt to develop a constructive way to address overarching environmental challenges and blaming China for all the environmental disasters that happen in the world. Chinese companies, whether we're talking mining, hydropower, or infrastructure projects, invest usually at the invitation of sovereign governments. If the objective of governments is industrial and economic development at all costs, they will find willing partners that do not have to be the Chinese. It could very well be the Japanese or the South Koreans, for example. At the same time, look at, for example, Indonesia and the new investment law that was passed in November last year. That law gave a carte blanche to foreign investors to engage in resource extraction and deforestation under the pretext of restarting the economy due to COVID. And my final point, my third overall finding, we are, broadly speaking, very far off from any type of climate leadership, including a Chinese climate leadership, which prioritizes environment over economic gains, and the type of leadership that should be coming out of the West is entirely lacking, both in their engagement with the global South and in their practices at home. This leadership is extremely important given that China is nowhere near yet to setting global accountability standards. And at the moment, the Chinese, at the very best, have only started following the overarching international standards. I'll stop here. Ben, you're muted.
I'm no longer unmuted. I just love Zoom and this challenge we all have. So my question was, I said, thank you very much. And then I said, one quick follow-up to you was you mentioned that countries don't have to take resources from China and Chinese companies. They could go to Indonesia or they could go to South Korea or Japan rather. So why then do they go to China if they have a choice? Why are they emphasizing China so much? What do you find in your research explains that?
Number one is speed. The Chinese are extremely fast and efficient. And number two is cost. The Chinese are much cheaper than everybody else.
Okay. And does that relate then to your issue of leadership on the environment, how the swiftness of economic development?
Well, since most governments, let's say the Indonesian government is interested in perpetuating resource extraction because this is how they jumpstart their economy. Of course, whoever can do it faster and at a lower cost is their best option. And so in thinking of how we redesign the paradigm between development and environmental sustainability, that is one of the key issues that we need to think about.
Great.
Because clearly the Indonesian government is more concerned with economic development at this point than environmental sustainability.
Yeah, I'm going to come back later to your interesting point too. I think a lot of scholars in this community have looked at COVID as a somewhat of a positive for re-entering in a post-COVID world that integrates the environment. But you're finding actually it's an effort to
Exactly the opposite
right?
in this
Yeah.
region.
Yeah,
Exactly
so
the opposite.
yeah, that's fascinating point. We're going to come back to in a big way shortly. And now I want to turn to Professor Nair to give her responses to the first two questions, which again are going to pave the way for the next two on the more applied part. So over to you, Sreeja.
Thank you, Ben, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us for this session. And I'm really happy to be sharing a bit about my own research on the topic of environment and sustainability. My research is on policy formulation and decision-making under uncertainty for complex environmental policy issues such as food security and climate change adaptation. I study the tools and processes of governments in making policy choices on a regular basis and also recalibrating them, and sometimes not, as the original policy context in which these policies were designed changes. A large part of this research has focused on South Asia, specifically India, and this was during my association with a policy think tank called the Energy and Resources Institute, which is based in New Delhi. And there I worked with an interdisciplinary team studying impacts of climate change on agriculture and water resources, and provide policy recommendations not only for state governments in India, but also contribute to national agriculture policy development. And over the past few years, my research has specifically focused on adaptive policy making or flexible policy making as the policy context changes, and policy experimentation and piloting as an important policy tool for governments to test alternative policy designs and new policy designs under these conditions of uncertainty. Talking about fit for purpose, from my research, I find that the idea of fit policy responses is much affected by science and politics and how they interplay. For example, what is technically appropriate may not be politically feasible to have as a policy strategy, and vice versa. With future policy uncertainty, then how do we design fit for purpose strategies today while ensuring flexibility that they are able to adapt with the changing policy context? In practice, from my experience, I find that actually a range of policy responses exist, from the more commonly seen incremental responses to deal with small and expected changes in the future policy context. These are happening in a rather linear way, and you can expect that this is how the policy context for this particular policy, this particular sector is likely to change, and then there are no big surprises there. But sometimes it could also be just a safe bet to respond to even large changes that are likely in the future, but that it's just safer to play, just do marginal changes to existing policies. But it could also lead, we also see sometimes transformative or, big changes from routine policies when the policy context has changed so much that the earlier strategies are no longer viable. Inability to respond to this kind of change in policy context could actually lead to costly policy delays, as we see in the case of climate change, or even have strategies which have now become counterproductive to achieving the policy goal, such as maladaptive strategies that can increase the vulnerability to climate change instead of decreasing it. Just a few points to wrap up my points here. In some of my classes, I'm asked by students how governments plan to operate under higher uncertainty then. From my work on adaptive policy making, I feel that some of the tools to deal with these unanticipated conditions have to do with continuous monitoring and review of current policies and learning, ensuring community networks are stable and social capital, and promoting variation in the responses in terms of trying out multiple policy alternatives instead of looking for one best one, and sometimes even just removing barriers to necessary policy adjustments that need to be made. I'll just stop at that for now. Thank you. Ben, you're
there-
muted. Yeah.
Yeah, the screen keeps changing on me. The Zoom screen keeps changing. Sometimes the mute button's there, sometimes it disappears. I was just going to follow up and ask you just a brief question about then, your work on policy pilots. I'm hearing from your presentation that it both allows governments to adapt and learn, but it's also a mechanism perhaps for incremental versus transformative change. So what do you find in terms of the politics of the use of policy pilots? When do we often see those in the context of India and other countries you've studied? And does that help explain then whether it's going to be transformative potentially or more incremental in this context?
Yeah, so what I find, especially in my study in India, is that some of these pilots were actually very transformative in the sense that they completely dismantled an ongoing policy. And I feel that the timing in terms of when these were launched, there was a high intention to actually bring about a major policy change. And it just so happened that the pilot was just launched exactly at that time. While there are others which are just to make small tweaks into what is happening regularly. But as researchers, I feel that it's important to know that pilots necessarily do not need to mean, and even for policymakers, that the term pilot doesn't have to mean that it needs to be radical, but it could actually be incremental as well as transformative if they are launched at a time when policy changes were due anyway.
Okay, I'm going to come back to this point because you're really reinforcing this notion of a critical juncture that's special in a certain moment in time. I'm going to come back to that after the second round, but thank you very much for those opening comments. And now we turn it over to Professor Thomas to answer the first two questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Let me first pay tribute to the ESG for your interest and all the things that you're working on as well. Just to follow the same pattern of my two panelists, Ben, I would take up your question and start by saying that the work that I'm doing here at the moment is under the umbrella of risk and resilience. And naturally, you can imagine that a big part of that is on the environment and climate change, where the broad finding is that despite a lot of different kinds of experiments and efforts made over the decades, this is one area that is clearly going the wrong way. The wrong way in terms of the effects on well-being of people and the planet. And the divide between what we know about these issues and what is being done about these issues is so large that it's hard to think of another area where the knowledge action gap is so glaring. And so the question has to be asked, what explains this extraordinary gulf between the scientific knowledge on what needs to be done and what policymakers, the business community, the economic advisors, and the public are not doing. So obviously we need to break this down into regions and sub-regions to get a handle on this. But in my work, in the research that especially we are currently doing, one subsection or a segment of it is on economic policies, why they have in a way done more harm than good on this issue. That is to say that economic growth, while it has brought poverty reduction, which we must applaud, has come at a cost which hurts everything, including economic growth itself. It is like shooting oneself in the foot. And it starts with the concept of economic growth being squarely based on GDP, in which G is the gross national product, and gross is obviously the wrong measure for anything. Nobody measures the happiness in gross terms. It has to be net of damages. And so how do we get at that? And some findings are beginning to suggest that if we could get that calculus right, not only in principle, but also in the hearts and minds of people, that could move the needle. So in the limited time right now, Ben, let me just say that one piece of that would be economic pricing that we think, if it were adopted and followed more broadly, could make a difference in real time. So in the context of climate change, that would be the pricing of air that we do not at the moment, and as a result, pollution goes unpunished. And when it's carbon and it accumulates as much as it does, then global warming follows, and from that, natural disasters become untenable. So can we, among other policies or requirements that we would need, use carbon pricing as a way much more broadly? It's tried on a few countries in few sectors, but used more broadly could make a difference. And if the pressure is suddenly on that everyone realizes that the sky is about to fall, maybe this line of approach would complement other efforts that are needed, which are more in the command and control variety, as well as behavioral changes, which are more voluntary in nature, bring about a sufficient change in real time. We use techniques, and we have to be careful. Again, as I said at the beginning, even these policies can do more harm than good. Just because the problem is so extraordinary, it doesn't mean that you have to think about the policies, because they could actually make it worse. But a sensibly done social benefit cost analysis could help us to determine carbon pricing, whether it's in the form of a tax or in the form of a command and control, like thou shalt not pollute more than so much, give us a handle on how far and how best to go with this. That's where the research is at, and we have some interesting findings on what sets of numbers would make a difference. And as the IPCC suggests, this needs to be within the next 10 years, and that may be an understatement of the calamity, and it can be translated in terms of going carbon neutral by such and such a date. And I will simply add that even when that plan makes sense in gross terms, we need to overload the efforts in the earlier year, meaning right now, because it takes long for them to bear fruit. And the exponential cost of waiting makes the premium on more immediate actions that much greater. So let me stop there.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to follow up also on a quick question now that we'll come back to later, because it's really fascinating and obviously really important. You know, someone like yourself who's been involved in this topic for quite some time, who's recognizing that the acuteness of the crisis means making the right policy design that can use market mechanisms in ways that actually address these problems. So my question for you is, and again, we'll come back to this some more later, is do you see the imperative now where your research is finding that whether you look at this from an economic lens or an ecological lens, the same answer appears? We must address this problem because the climate crisis is simultaneously hurting both the market and the ecology. Are you finding that that this synergy is something that's being advocated for political feasibility reasons? The geopolitics are such that you simply won't get action without making this point? Or are you finding that actually the evidence is quite clear empirically that there will be synergies? And I raise that in the context of Nordhaus's recent analysis that the optimal price of carbon would lead to a 3.2 degree world, which is still quite a bit over what the IPCC and the Paris Accord has said is required. So how do you come down in your research on whether this synergy is a feasibility argument or an empirical observation that there simply are always going to be the same answer, whether you look at this from an economic or environmental perspective. What does your research tell us about those different perspectives?
I think thanks, Ben. I think the political economy of this is rather intractable. One is that you have a two-step causation, which is hard to take account of, unlike COVID, where it's more direct, the virus and morbidity and mortality. Here you have carbon emissions, and then you have the next step of warming, and then you have the next step of leading to natural disasters, and questions asked at every stage. And frankly, a lot of people are probably not clear how A leads to B and then B to C, and where you should cut the tape. So in that sense, there is appeal or attraction to use the market mechanism as well as command and control, so that the natural instinct is to pollute less. So the principal argument, before we get into the politics of it, is strong. Then the question is, well, it's been talked about and not done so far. It has the same political economy reason why special interests stand in the way of carbon taxes. Is plainly put, the oil and gas and coal lobby. Then the question is, well, if you had an optimal tax, you will get 3.2 degrees.
Right.
Well, an optimal tax. That's why you're not getting it. And Nordhaus's comment is interesting because he was one who suggested a rather high discount rate for environmental goods and services in the 90s, which is contrary to what Stern proposed in 2005, which is a much lower discount rate that allows for the investments in climate and environment more feasible than otherwise. So I question that discussion of optimality as being truly optimal if you're using such a high discount rate, meaning the future matters less than it really should, right? I think that maybe I'll stop here, but the bottom line, maybe just I'll add, in the case of COVID, because of that direct link and people feel it in their hearts, we raised $20 trillion in a year or less of financing to deal with it. Whereas in the case of climate, even talking about 100 billion a year is a stretch. And so we need all the instruments to bridge this gap, that the problem is among the greatest that we've seen, but the action is among the lowest that we have seen as well.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate your answer. I'm going to come back to this in the next round too, about the geopolitics as both constraining but also enabling policy design. And the argument you're making that it's so acute now that we have to recognize these long-term impacts of both the economy and the environment, which undisputed now, I think really resonates with this community. So now we're going to go to the second set of questions. And again, for the audience, feel free to put some questions in the chat box. And of course, we'll come back to your own questions after the second round as well. But I'm going to share my screen again, just to show you these questions. And so here are the second set of questions we're going to pose of our three panelists. What are some lessons then from your analysis for helping develop fit for purpose policy analysis in Asia? And then related, how do you communicate your research findings for them to be applied in the policy process? And what might your insights how might your insights be better connected to policymakers? So for those two questions, I will turn it over now to Professor Marina Kaneti, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I'm very eager to speak to the first question on the key lessons. But when it comes to the second question, Maybe I'll let the other speakers speak before me. Okay, so let me give you my 3 lessons. Lesson 1, and this probably builds a little bit on the conversation that you just had with Vinod, is that there is a need for a major paradigm shift and clear understanding that environmental preservation needs to be part of an overall development process. But at the same time, there have not been very clear incentives to this to happen at a policy level, particularly in the global south. And lesson 2, related to lesson 1, is that many of the current matrices and frameworks celebrating, so to speak, a turn to sustainability are woefully inadequate. So let me give you 2 examples. For example, many analysts right now are pointing that in terms of monetary value, China's overseas investments in hydro are surpassing for the first time their investments in fossil fuels. So they see this as something very positive, which to many it might be the case. But this is not, investment in hydro does not necessarily mean environmentally or ecologically sustainable, as is the case in many parts in this part of the world, including one that I'm looking at in Batang Toru in Indonesia. Another example on a Chinese major investment in the Lamu port in Kenya, maybe some of you know about this. This was celebrated as a victory when the Kenyan fishermen were compensated $18 million for the type of loss of livelihoods because of the construction of the deep port. But you can imagine what kind of environmental damage happens when people are compensated $18 million. And there is very little conversation on how to restore the marine life that will be lost because of the construction of this deep port. And my lesson 3 is that the turn to green economy, whichever way we want to define it, is ripe for leadership and innovative solutions, especially incorporating local knowledge as part of an overarching green agenda. And for example, there has been a lot of hype. I'm sure conference participants talk about this and know about this, about the mangrove forests as a carbon sink. So this has been very popular here as well in the region, but still not explored enough to the level where it will become an environmental policy that governments will pursue. So I'll stop here for now.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on your theme and your point that the examples that countries and some national units give about being sustainable might not actually be examples out fit for purpose policies, depending upon what your actual objectives are. And I'm curious about your example of the fishers and the compensation that was paid, because that fits an overall principle since the first Rio Earth Summit that the polluter pays, right? But the polluter pays metaphor or principle actually allows for pollution to occur. You just pay for it rather than stopping the pollution in the first place. And I'm wondering whether in that example, that's what happened. It wasn't so much stopping the impact, but allowing for the compensation of the impact. Is that a fair way of capturing what you were saying?
That's exactly right. And actually the fishermen have not been compensated yet. So even the court ruling came out, right? So this is also the difference between the policy and the legal framework and what actually happens on the ground, where the court says you have to compensate and people don't get actually compensated.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, there's a green light for the project to continue.
Yeah. Or a rule that says don't do it in the first place, right? So no compensation to be had, right? Where's that conversation going? And certainly we know from the work on biodiversity that, saying don't do it can be a very fit for purpose policy, right? But polluter pays may not necessarily be always fit for purpose. So your example, I think, stands out, and we'll come back to that again as well. But let's turn it over now to Sreeja Nair for her initial response to these questions.
Thanks, Ben. So in terms of some lessons from my analysis for fit-for-purpose policy analysis in Asia, long-term policy making, especially for the environment, one of the biggest challenges is that there is a mismatch between the timescales over which the planners operate and the timescale over which the impact of their policy decisions will be observed. And we see this a lot in environmental policy making. For example, in urban settings, land use change, the planning is for a couple of decades typically, but any kind of land use change and its impact on the urban environment, it would be felt for more than a couple of decades, running into centuries. And how do you plan adequately then? And going back to my work on policy piloting, so this is what I discuss in my new book on rethinking policy piloting, in which I specifically study design features of selected policy pilots from Indian agriculture. And what I did was look at certain pilots which were launched by the Central Ministry of Agriculture in India to address risks and uncertainties to agriculture production. Now, again, agriculture is a sector where any decision that you take today, it would have long-term impacts in terms of changing the value chains, changing the cropping patterns of the region, and the type of crops that are grown, and whether it is suited to the region. So it would have long-term impacts. So what I find out from that is that the role of piloting in this sense could be that they can contribute to policy development. Typically, they have only been looked at in terms of whether they expanded geographically or not. That is, if they scaled up to reach more beneficiaries or not. But what I find is that pilots can exhibit a range of forms and types in between. And it doesn't mean the pilot has failed. It just means there are various ways in which it could assimilate into policy design. And also there is a push and pull between what I was mentioning earlier about technical and political factors which influence their policy translation. And successful design, implementation, and scaling up of these pilots is not an automatic process. There are a lot of factors involved in it. Moving on to the fourth question, which is in which how do you communicate your research findings so that to policymakers? Now, planning for a future which looks very different from what is expected is difficult, and not only for policymakers, but how do we convince, say, farming communities to consider alternate futures in their decision making? For example, for farmers to move to drought-tolerant crop varieties or temperature-tolerant crop varieties based on model projections from scientists for the next 50 to 100 years, when all the farmer is thinking about is to have a good harvest in the next season. And also when they don't see any water scarcity in the near term, how do we convince them to change their decisions based on projections for 100 years or 50 years? Pilots can definitely help plan for a range of probable futures, though I recall from some of my conversations with policymakers in India that this is not an experiment, this is a pilot. So it made me think if the term pilot was more politically palatable, because governments don't want to be seen as actively experimenting all the time or being unsure and experimenting with the public and public resources. And also there are the issues of who is included in a pilot and who is excluded. So pilots, no matter how small they are in scale and scope, they come with the risk of failure and also reputational consequences if they don't work out. So they are just as political as full-scale policies. So as researchers, especially for environmental policy making, climate change, adaptation, there are so many initiatives done in a pilot form. But as researchers also, we need to be able to understand that there is it is just as political. And probably we need to recalibrate our enthusiasm around it as well. And also to policymakers to understand that it need not be radical all the time. And piloting can actually become a more conscious activity that forms a regular feature of policy making, especially kind of agricultural policy making, without the apprehension that the word experiment really brings. So I'd stop at that, and I'll answer any questions that may come up later.
Just one quick follow-up on that too. I mean, it's fascinating. You mentioned before about this sort of critical moment where piloting can either make a difference or not. And in your responses there, you mentioned how calling them pilots versus experiments as a cognitive perception of what might even be the same kind of effort could be helpful in generating support. So is part of your results around the policy design conclusions that the very cognitive frames of a policy matter for the critical juncture moment?
Yes, it definitely does, because not in India, but there are other country governments. It's like I see a lot in UK, for example, piloting, experimentation, it becomes an active part of much of their policy making, and there are, reports being written and all that. So it does play a major role in how the policymaker thinks about that. Experiment doesn't mean that they are just there are some elements that they are testing, but it doesn't mean that they are, they don't know what they're doing. And so the term experiment kind of, at least in Indian agriculture context, the policymakers I spoke to, there was this kind of hesitation. And when you say pilot, there was this kind of, the feedback was that, we know what we are doing, it's not really testing, it's not really experimenting. We know what we're doing, we're very sure. There seems to be a high degree of intentionality, which kind of counters how we see an experiment as a researcher, that, it needs to be tested, you're testing out something, it's because you don't know.
Right.
But in practice, there is a hesitation to see it like that, or admit it, that, we are trying out, but it's more like we are ironing out the details. And rather than whether it will work, we are seeing how it will work. So there seems to be a high degree of intentionality, or even though technically it may seem that, you're just trying out something. And in fact, this is the reason why several pilots which shouldn't be running are still running, because technically they are not doing a good job, but they're running because there's a high degree of intentionality to make it run and make it a success, or just keep it going till it merges with policy in some way.
Yeah, just a final editorial comment for myself. I find this fascinating because the ESG community and a lot of researchers are focused on the idea of climate policy experiments, for example. But that means quite different things to different scholars and different researchers. And you're really coming back to this point that the very idea of experiments might lead to more of a Lindblom-esque muddling through, when in fact pilots might perhaps give us a possibility of more of a Simon-esque transformative approach. So I think that's really important for the geopolitics, but also for the policy design frame that we bring to these questions. And again, I'll return some of those themes momentarily. But I want to now turn it over to Professor Thomas for then his thoughts on what this all means for the actual development of fit-for-purpose policy analysis and the ways in which that's communicated to policymakers.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Taking up those last two questions briefly. On the first one, the fit-for-purpose thinking takes us to the idea that Asia, in a way, could be the most diverse region, not just in population policies, population income and policies, but when you think of climate change, you have quite a mix. So at the one end of the spectrum, if you think of the climate contribution in aggregate terms, China would be the #1 in the world, and India would be #3. If you think of per capita, China would be 2, India would be quite a bit further down the road. Then you have a group of countries, Southeast Asia, who may not have a very high per person emission, but the rate of change, that is how much are you adding to the fossil fuels and carbon emissions, is about the highest in the world. So that includes the Southeast Asian countries and the rapidly growing ones like Vietnam. And there is an issue. Indonesia would be both large in sheer size of emissions, but also the problem of fossil fuels. And then you have the low-income countries, Bangladesh, borderline, and then Nepal, and so on, where there is a question of what they should do within this context. I did not mention Singapore, but of course, the highest per capita in the region, very small carbon footprint, but per capita emissions obviously very high. So within this framework, who should do what also takes you to a different aspect of this thing we have not mentioned, and that is climate action. If you want to divide it into two broad parts, one would be prevention or mitigation, and the other would be coping or adaptation. Obviously, both are important for all, but does that differ according to the kind of groupings that I mentioned? So the discussion immediately turns to the income level of countries, growth needs or requirements of countries, who can afford what, and to the question of climate justice, regardless of how much more you're adding today, who is responsible for where we are today as well. All of these are clearly important, but in a policy perspective and fit for purpose discussion, results matter. We can discuss all we want, but what would take us to a decline in the increase in carbon emissions as quickly as possible over the next 8 to 10 years is the question. There clearly everyone has to play a role. And since I mentioned Singapore, even Singapore with a very small footprint has a big role in carbon mitigation, not just adaptation, because as part of Southeast Asia, it's hard to imagine the rest of Southeast Asia, which has a huge burden of making the situation worse in terms of carbon emissions, playing its part if the highest income country is also not modeling that behavior. And so one way or the other, all countries have a piece, but the bottom line is inescapable that if China and India do not reduce the total in sufficient measure, and Japan, of course, and Indonesia, then all bets are off. So how do we get there? And that's where the Glasgow meetings of this year, where countries will commit again to their carbon trajectory. All eyes will be on the big emitters as well as then what the small emitters are doing. I should have mentioned in passing also the Pacific Islands, where the carbon footprint is very low, but the damage could not be higher. It's truly existential. And so adaptation, in a way we have not even thought about or talked about, become extremely relevant. Well, within that panorama, just a brief word on communication. In an earlier segment, I mentioned that we have the greatest knowledge action divide that we have seen in the case of climate change. So what are we doing wrong in communicating this? I mean, why doesn't action follow a little bit more naturally? And the mitigation adaptation piece that I mentioned gives us a hint. In my class, for example, when it comes to one's own countries, the split between how much they should do on mitigation and adaptation is always lowest for my own country, meaning it should be mostly adaptation and least mitigation. So clearly the thinking that we have naturally is that mitigation is a price we are paying, meaning prevention, or someone else should do. how do we see that as actually contributing to my well-being as much as anybody else's is a puzzle. So communication has to represent a mitigation as one doing it in one's own interest, because if the existential problem is solved, there is no growth that you're going to have, and there is no poverty reduction that you would be doing down the road. So that is one big piece to think of mitigation of climate change as growth friendly. You may almost have to think of it in reverse, that if you did not mitigate, there will be no growth. It's not the other way around. It's not that if I mitigate, I would grow less. So that's one. And maybe I'll just add one more part of the findings or research, that in the poor communication, there is enough blame to go around. First of all, the fossil fuel lobby has done the opposite, that rather than highlighting the difficulty of fossil fuels on climate change, it has hidden or suppressed that information quite effectively and sold the idea that climate change is a hoax. This is then coupled with a rather ineffective effort on the part of, I mentioned, economists at one part of the spectrum, not saying anything much. Quarterly Journal of Economics, one of the highest rated economic journal, has not produced one article on climate change, as though it's unrelated to economics. At the other part of the spectrum, where economic growth is seen as one that conflicts with climate change, then that growth analysis does not help, that hurts. Then the press and the media, I think there has been a lot written about climate change lately. One gap would be that in real time, when natural disasters do take place, the discussion is as though it's all Mother Nature, and the description is all about the wind speed and all the things that are problematic. But the root cause needs to be called out in the midst of the crisis, so that communication to people will register the idea that there's a two-part chain reaction, and at the root of what we are observing in terms of the aggravation of natural disasters is the carbon emissions, as well as other greenhouse gases. That needs to be addressed, and that communication has not been effective thus far. And they all can be changed, but they need action.
Yeah, thank you all three for those really fascinating insights. You've all raised questions about how to perceive of the crisis, and how, whether it's you're measuring per capita emissions or change in emissions, or whether you're measuring another kind of sustainability challenge, be the fisheries or the work that I do, forests. I want to come back to that notion of how the geopolitics connect to the construction of the policy problem itself. But before I do that, we've got a question from one of our audience members. I want to turn to that one first. Then let it come back to the constructivist question, and then we'll open it up for some more questions. But this question comes from Wiki Navalia, who says, and this is really, I think, directed mostly at Sreeja. I'm wondering about the idea of incremental transformative pilots that Sreeja mentioned earlier, and how might these kinds of pilots be distinguished from incremental, more of the same solutions that perpetuate the existing problems. So Sreeja, do you want to take a crack at that question?
Yeah, and if I understood it correctly, I think you're asking about the difference between, say, an incremental pilot versus transformative. Now, an example would be, so incremental, typically they want to test marginal changes in what in regular activities. For example, routine land and water management activities in agriculture. You make small changes in, so you're expecting changes in the climate, so you make small changes in the routine activities, not big changes. So nothing is really changing in terms of what you're doing, but just tweaking it a little bit. So like altering the time of irrigation, or how much irrigation, how much water needs to be given to the plants, the sowing period, things like that. Transformative, on the other hand, is more, say, when growing a particular type of crop is no longer viable on that soil, in that land. So what do you do? The more transformative measures would be, move to completely new land use activities altogether. For example, in some, just so that you can sustain, there can be income for people who are dependent on that land. So in some places, it's even moved from, say, rice farming to, using it for aquaculture. And so transformation not necessarily is a good thing, but it may just become the only, only thing to be done, because what you were doing so far, because the climate has changed so much, or the soil has been deprived of nutrients, that you have to alter the way you were functioning so far. So, but it is very difficult as compared to incremental, because it requires change in mindset. Why should I invest in this new crop? What if it doesn't survive? Everyone else has been doing this for decades. There's a lot of change in mindset, and the institutional support for this absolutely new type of strategies that are required. So it is very difficult, and it doesn't happen overnight. It takes like decades for this transformation to happen. But incremental would be something that is more ongoing on a regular basis.
But to follow up on that really interesting response, what is it for the policy design part of this conversation that piloting contributes to this transformative process? What do pilots do that regular policies don't do?
So pilots offer that kind of a safe window, so to say, that if you're not fully sure, why isn't it launched as a pilot? Even though, despite all the reputational issues and all, but it's still it is okay that pilots are a little ambiguous and there is somewhat of a conflict around it. But pilots are kind of still they offer that kind of safe zone for policymakers to try out different things. And if sometimes they are launched smartly, in the sense that when a policy change was due anyway, or when an idea needs to be really tested, or there's a champion in the policymakers who wants to push a particular idea, and then so that the whole idea of critical juncture, that's where the politics of it comes in. That sometimes it's not so random. It's very, very intentional of why a particular strategy. Sometimes they are timed with like in India, they have the 5-year development planning, and then when a particular plan is supposed to end, they kind of perfectly time the new pilot to kind of come in, just so that resources can be matched and allocated. So sometimes it's just as simple as that. But I think that pilots still offer that kind of safe zone to policymakers to try out something new, or without being kind of held, kind of a mechanism to hedge the risk of launching a full-fledged policy right away.
Yeah. So I want to come to this question that I'm hearing from all of you, which is that on the one hand, there's this desire or interest to conduct fit for purpose policy analysis where problems are identified clearly, and then scholarship and applied policy analysis might have some kind of role, be they adaptation, changing agricultural systems, fisheries, forests, and climate. But I'm also hearing from you also that there's relevance here for shifting the problem definition away from your own challenges. So that, in other words, the blame avoidance strategies, which is the opposite side of fit for purpose. How do you actually shift the problems to others, right? And I'm wondering whether all of your research then doesn't speak to that. We've heard from, Marina then around polluter pays, but the fishers aren't getting paid. But then the problem is actually how much to pay them versus the actual impact itself, right? And we're hearing from Vinod that depending upon how you think about responsibilities on the climate crisis, you get a different kind of possible policy response. So you can measure per capita. And by the way, here we are in Asia, fantastic economic developments occurring, innovations really strong, the region's dynamic. This is the place to be in so many ways. And yet we know, as all three panels have told us, whether it's biodiversity loss or the climate crisis or in between, the challenges are really acute. So, the constructivists would tell us in our community, well, wherever you draw a line on a map and you call that a country, the larger the line, the more the responsibilities, right? So we can draw a line around any 1.2 billion people anywhere in the world, and they'll be one of the largest emitters of carbon. Or we can draw a line around any 5 million, and they'll be some of the least emitters in the world. But it's simply a constructed concept because, of course, it's economic activity that causes these emissions, and the wealthy tend to benefit from that. So under that line of reasoning, those that are small countries would want to construct a certain source of knowledge to say, well, we're small because we're 5 million. But doesn't that actually kind of reinforce the blame avoidance problem as much as it does the fit for purpose policy analysis? In other words, are we all being part of a constructed knowledge generating exercise we're part of this game that different organizations, different actors want to draw on to shift attention? One last example before I offer your thoughts on this, panelists, is, as Marina mentioned, deforestation in Indonesia. One can say this is Indonesia's responsibility. It's ongoing. It's causing climate emissions too. Or you can say, my work in private governance, actually, global supply chains are the cause of this deforestation. The demand is coming from elsewhere. And so the responsibilities lie in the supply chain. But that then leads to a so-called fit for purpose eco-labeling exercise that can often not actually address the problem itself. So what are your thoughts on then how this is perhaps not just an exercise in fit for purpose policy analysis at the geopolitics level, but is also an exercise in blame avoidance as well? That would be the other side of the pendulum in changing problem definitions or responsibilities rather than addressing them head on. How do you come down on that kind of the knowledge being constructed as part of the geopolitics of the region? And Marina, well, I'll just go in order. Marina, we'll begin with you and we can go in the same order.
I'm happy to start by actually turning your question on its head a little bit, because one way to look at what you're saying and think about what you're saying is to think of this as a catch-22 problem where, one avoidance leads to another, and it's sort of a vicious cycle where there's either a blame game or some other game going on. And at the end of the day, we just keep destroying the environment, and there's no end to it. But another way, in my more optimistic ways of thinking about this, is that hopefully and perhaps this geopolitical tug of war that exists and this blame game that goes on is actually also some stimulus for some changes to happen. And not to attribute any causality to this, but so, for example, we know that there's the Belt and Road Initiative, and we also know that Biden, not too long ago, launched the B3W, Build Back Better initiative, right? And one of the things that the B3W said is that unlike the Belt and Road Initiative, it will be sustainable and environmentally friendly and so on and so forth. The Chinese have not responded directly to B3W other than saying you're a little too late on this whole gaming the world and positioning geopolitically. But there is a push, there is a challenge there, right? That now the Chinese, through the Belt and Road Initiative, have to keep up with, right? So even if it's an after fact, not the main impetus for the B3W versus the Belt and Road Initiative, the element of environmental sustainability has been placed as a major part of the contention. And yes, to an extent, it can still resolve in a blame game or whatever, but it actually might be a very productive way of how do we move forward? How do we keep innovating? How do we find solutions that will actually prove either side to be in a better position to deliver on environmentally sustainable development? So that's kind of my alternative thinking on this.
Yeah, no, and that's a promising one, especially because in both cases, China and the US, its reputational image seems to play a role in this ratcheting up, not just ratcheting down.
Exactly.
So how that happens and how we can think as a community to offer advice for that kind of design upward and not downward, I think you're hitting on a really great point that we can probably spend a lot more time as a community thinking about, right, and translating to the policy world. So thank you. Yeah, fantastic. Sreeja, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, on blame avoidance, it's actually very interesting that, you know, you may have the best scientific knowledge available, but if you choose not to kind of believe in it. I remember there was a policymaker, we were working on a climate change action plan for one of the states in India, and we were talking of sea level rise scenarios. And, you know, what his point was, you know, it's a problem if you accept that it's a problem. So, you know, otherwise there is no reason for us to prepare for an extreme case scenario and invest all our resources. So I think many times it boils down to allocation of resources and justification for that allocation for, say, how do you plan for a 1 in 100 year flood, for example?
Right.
And how do you justify moving a lot of resources in a, you know, especially in a lot of developed and, you know, less developed countries in Asia, who have so many pressing priorities? How do you justify? And this goes to Prof. Thomas's point also, that why is climate change receiving, you know, not enough attention, whereas, you know, one such 1 in 100 flood, 1 in 100 year flood, just one of it could set back many of these nations through decades of, you know, economic growth. So, but how do you really, who is the policymaker who will kind of fight for it to say that, you know, I am going to invest heavily in this, building this big seawall because I think it's important. And, you know, because people don't see it as urgent, and people don't see it as, you know, sometimes it's hard to make that justification for a massive investment, which you don't see as happening anytime soon, or it's only a probabilistic, you know, figure that you see by science, put forward by scientists. So it makes kind of action very hard that way.
Yeah, and that's an interesting take too, because it's not so much blame avoidance as it is simply the problems that are competing for our cognitive frames. And the 100-year ones are difficult to achieve. So how do we change the cognitive frames that may be as important to communities, but just not thinking about them because they're so abstract, right? Which is of course the challenge with so many of these environmental problems. Thank you. Yeah, Vinod, how do you come down on this, constructing knowledge to avoid the problems versus solving them?
Yeah, starting with that, and very briefly on your earlier point or questions as well on the size of the country, etc.
Yeah.
So on this one, of course, I think all the great points Marina and Sreeja made, and then yourself, which I might just add, also connecting to something I saw online from the group. The big fear that a country has is, if I took action on climate, I'm going to be less competitive than someone else. Whereas over a period of time, it is exactly the opposite, but it's not believed clearly. So competition or competing on economic ground seems to go against the idea of getting some good results on environment and climate change, and cooperation would be the better model for that, clearly, because it's deeply enrooted in people's minds that doing something on the environment is anti-growth. Of course, in Asia, in our context, as the ASEAN and so on, which frankly has not been able to deliver on sharing resources as well as managing the climate crisis in a cooperative way and produce results in real time. So how can we improve on that? So I'll leave it at that. But there is also in the risk literature, transferring risk is like insurance is part of the solution. So this is both a nice thing to do, but also supported rigorously by the analysis. Just a quick word on what you rightly raised. What if all countries were the same size? Would we be discussing about China, India on the one hand, and Vietnam, Thailand on the other, et cetera, et cetera? Well, if all the same size to get any result, you need the same amount of pollution control by all. But even more powerful, what if the natural disasters are proportional to the amount of emissions a country makes? You will see immediate action. So I think the rich countries or whoever is being hit by disasters more will react very, very, very fast if they were too hit by the disasters. So there is a policy mismatch in a way with the way things are laid out. And so one, maybe an answer to your question would be per capita, is that more likely to lead to avoidance? Without total, we will not get enough results in time. How about something that is related to how much you're producing, the emissions per GDP, or a combination of the three? But we clearly need a breakthrough on how we account for the emissions by a country in order both to get results and to have some sense of climate, environmental justice as well.
Yeah, and the issue there, I think, is given the different possibilities of how we measure emissions, how do countries themselves act? Going to deflect the problem from their own economic development interests or not is I think a key question coming out of this conversation. I want to turn over to the audience now with the few minutes we have left before we spend a little bit of time on the networking part of this, if there's interest. But yeah, I'm just going to throw it out to the audience. I can't see you because it's a virtual conference, so it's very frustrating. But I know you're out there, so please raise your hand or type something in the chat box of any or all of the participants. This is your chance to get.
There's a question in the chat box. See, Ben.
I did read that one in the chat box already.
There's one on competition and cooperation.
Oh, there is? Am I missing one?
Yeah,
it's in the Q&A one.
Yeah, there is a question on competition.
Oh, right here. Sorry, there's two different parts. Q&A. I got it. Okay, from Ishian's son. Okay, apologize. He writes, the fundamental question is whether geopolitical tensions will trigger more cooperation. I'm not sure if simple competition without cooperation can work for the issue of climate change. Anybody want to respond to that? Or Ishian, do you want to elaborate that? I can give you the power of speaking. I can unmute you as moderator. I can unmute you. It's got to find you on my list here. So without me unmuting you, you cannot speak, and I can't find you now. So we'll just leave your question as is. but before I go to the next one, anybody want to respond to Shing's point that you need cooperation, not just competition?
May I just say that on that one, we do not want a race to the bottom, which could be triggered in the environment climate world by the competition that's of the wrong kind. I was actually reading that question while I was answering you.
Right.
So competing on the economic front, and therefore thinking that the environmental investment will go against that, would be a fundamental problem that will go against everybody. And so models of cooperation clearly not only make sense, it's the only way to go, race to the top.
Yeah. And the question, I think, too, is how to do that.
Can I be a little bit of a contrarian and make it more exciting for everyone, including for myself? Well, we actually, if we look at history, we have a very good example of competition that actually produced quite remarkable results. And that is during the Cold War, the space race. And so because there is a increasing discourse on a new Cold War, chances are cooperation is not really going to be much of an option. So perhaps the lesson that we need to learn from history is what happened during the space race and how much of the space race type of competition produces the type of innovation and new ways of thinking that might be also relevant for dealing with climate change. Just for fun.
Yeah, that's interesting because in the Singaporean context, geopolitically, you would say, well, this makes a lot of sense because Singapore is at the top of its game on innovation. So it's clearly situated well to do fit for purpose innovations on the technology front, right? So perhaps if we're standing back and reflecting, we say that's a pretty darn good way to foster design in the Singaporean context. But maybe in Indonesia, it's a different kind of space race, right?
Yeah, I was thinking China and the United States, but that's
sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, again, big versus small, right? And how we mean by big as well. But yeah, totally. The second question from Robin Mansfield. I'm interested in this idea of growth. It is used with economic terms. What would happen if the term growth is used with environmental terms or social outcomes as a measure? Why do we use it with the economic as an economic term? So perhaps, Vinod, you want to take a crack at that first?
Let me just say that it's really in many ways the fundamental question, at least to the extent that this is what's driving policy making. All the discussions in the world on the environment is overtaken by what is considered to be good for short-term growth, and short-term because the life cycle of many of the politicians is also short. And maybe people also express interest in the short-term much more than the long-term. But in any case, if we could have counted growth in terms of well-being, not just for the short-term, but for a period of time, and if that were used to rank countries as opposed to short-term GDP growth, that would do it. That would make a huge difference. Right now, investors run to countries which are ranked high on the wrong measure, which is the gross national product growth. What if they were ranked on the basis of something more on the social with a slightly longer time frame? And you will see that it makes a huge difference to the ranking. We have from the UNDP a fascinating report a few months ago on ranking countries, not just on economic growth, not just on social and economic, but add to that the environmental damage they're making to the world. If that were a serious policy instrument, then the investment patterns will change and motivate countries to do the kind of things that we have been talking about in the last hour and a half. So I pay tribute to this question.
But isn't a bit behind the question the implicit argument that why worry about economic growth? So let's say you're right, and in 100 years, it's better for the economy to do something for the environment. Isn't it behind the question that, yeah, but given economic measures tend to be measured in 1 to 10 year time span, why go there? Okay, if you're right, you'll get economic benefits anyway, but thinking about the economy will lead to pretty much short-term orientations. So what's the rationale for even going in this direction? Just say, save the planet, right?
Just to say that that would be ideal. I don't know, except 2 or 3 countries where short-term economic growth is the central piece around which finance ministers and leaders of the country are making policies or responding. So there is a discussion, there needs to be a discussion on how mindsets can be changed. But in the meantime, time is running out and economic growth is driving. So I'm thinking that given that focus, can at least change the measure, stop measuring and ranking countries on short-term GDP growth, but as the speaker, the commentator was saying, inject social and environment operationally and use that measure. That could bring about some change.
So this is interesting, coming back to economic growth is generally what's driving the geopolitics. So let's then use that as a feasibility calculation to address the environment. I guess one last question on follow-up for Sreeja is in your work, do you find that it is economic growth that's driving the policy pilots, or are other factors at play in your work on sustainability as the rationale for the pilots in the first place? Is it economic growth that's the main factor?
In agriculture, I don't specifically see that, because a lot of pilots which I covered, they were targeting, small and marginal farmers. So I didn't see this big disconnect over there. But I can see where there are other, environmental areas. For example, biodiversity conservation. Placing a price on loss of a species, and why should you conserve species and loss of ecosystem services. I think this whole difficulty in not understanding what we lose when we say one species disappears from the ecosystem. It's just so hard to measure it. That any kind of to put a price or a dollar value, it's just so hard on it, which is why a lot of these it's so challenging as compared to. So we can always say if jobs are lost or this industry is impacted, then this is the economic damage that would happen. But it's so difficult for a lot of environmental issues to say that.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just going to read the last 2 comments and then ask you guys to both respond to those comments and then any quick thoughts you might have. We're going to switch to the networking session shortly, but I just wanted to give the voice to these last 2 comments. Yishin Sun responds to Marina's point by saying, just a comment, in my opinion, the rhetoric of the new Cold War is too risky. So the rhetoric alone, he's arguing, is a risky approach and will mislead the world. I think we should avoid that rhetoric. And then Shiran Lee says, he comes back to the point about the entire panel here, right? Hey, okay, yeah, Southeast Asia, definitely, but where do the problems really begin? And the question is, countries in the South often lack resources and capacity to develop in a sustainable way. How do you view the problem of inequality and injustice happen in the course of achieving sustainable development in the global South? There really isn't time to answer that in detail, but it is the broader point about what are the responsibilities of Southeast Asia. It's now developing. Certainly, Singapore is a great example of that. But in the broader global politics, it's not the it wasn't the place where a lot of these challenges first began. Any quick responses to that? Any kind of last quick minute thoughts before we get into the a few minutes on the networking part of this, where we go to a different Zoom. But any to all panelists, begin with Marina, any last thoughts on this or anything?
Sure. So let me just say that bringing up the Cold War was not for the purposes that we should have a new Cold War. I would probably be the last person on earth to want a Cold War, having lived through one. The point was that competition is not necessarily destructive, that the space race actually produced remarkable achievements in terms of countries being able to go into space and now exploring Mars and developing new technologies that were previously entirely in science fiction only. And perhaps we need to look at competition in a different way. And on the point about countries in the South lacking the resources and capacity, I just want to complicate the question a little bit, because this is, of course, absolutely true. But I'll give you again the example of Indonesia, where the Indonesian coal lobby makes sure that the price of coal is lower than the price of green and alternative sources for electricity, right? So when we are talking about countries in the South, are we talking about government priorities of the South, or are we talking about people? And when we bring the question of justice and rights, how do we differentiate between organized lobbies in these countries in particular, and how people on the ground actually are capable of living their lives?
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Marina. And I'm going to turn to Sreeja now. Just for quick, we're actually running over. People are leaving the room, but Sreeja, last thoughts?
So the issue of resources and capacity is a big one in this region, and there are, especially in climate change, we see mechanisms in which this kind of technology transfer, funding opportunities do arise, but there are also a lot of institutional challenges that need to be ironed out to really ensure that kind of fairness so even the RED mechanisms, for example, reducing emissions from deforestation, and so they all have there are some mechanisms to kind of transfer capacity and resources from, say, the global north to global south, but with its challenges. So it's a deeper issue over there. Yeah.
Thank you. And Vinod.
I know we are out of time, probably. Just in addition to what Marina said on the coal price, yes, I think not only is the price subsidized, but if you put in the context of the health impacts of coal, the IMF calculates that relative to the price it should be, which is the price plus a tax on the damage being done, and the actual price being the price minus the subsidy being given, then the loss, or the most incredible thing in the face of its damage, the amount of encouragement coal is getting is $5 trillion. So that's like a third of the COVID budget that I mentioned earlier. But on the carbon financing, the climate financing, just also to endorse what Sreeja said, the inequality link is not so clear that if you were more sustainable, you would have to worry about more inequality. I would have thought it would be the other way. But on the needs of financing, even if we say, and rightly, that not all cleaner ways of growing, developing are more expensive, there is a cost of transition without a doubt, and low-income countries are rightly saying that we would also like to join in the transition to a low-carbon world, but it does require, at least in transition, substantial financing, and it just has not been forthcoming to the extent, and that would be again a huge point that the developed rich countries will have to address.
And that's a great point to end on, because the financing policy designs can go in either direction. It can actually end up undermining the problem or can solve it. And how we do that well will become a really key part of the new center we're developing, of which these three faculty will be a key part. So please join me in thanking our three panelists for the really thoughtful presentations of the research and to linking scholarship to practice. So join me, the remaining people who are still here. You can put your hand up or do the clap thing on Zoom, whatever, or you can just do it like this. And thank you very much for taking the time to share with us all of your insights and wisdom.